Hi everyone, welcome everyone. As many of you know, I'm Sheetal Kalantri and I'm a clinical professor here at the law school where I started the International Human Rights Clinic. I'm grateful for the Human Rights Society and the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago for co-sponsoring this event. We are very pleased to have with us Jamil Dakwar, who directs the ACLU's Human Rights Program. His team uses international human rights language, mechanisms, and frameworks to promote legal and social change in the United States. So whenever I work on projects involving human rights in the US, I often encounter skepticism. Some people have told me that they don't think human rights violations occur in America, in the United States. They occur somewhere in Africa, not here. Other more thoughtful objections I get include the following. First, we already have civil rights protections, arguably stronger than what UN treaties provide, so why do we need international human rights? Second, people say, well, why should we let other countries tell us what to do, or a UN organization? This is sort of the sovereignty argument. Another objection is, well, why should we engage with UN mechanisms or regional mechanisms? They're not enforceable and have no binding force anyway. It's not like the UN will ever send men and women in blue helmets to enforce anything in the United States. So instead of answering this question, I'm going to do a technique that many of your law professors might employ, which is ask someone else. And I don't know anyone better in this country, perhaps, than Jamil to answer these questions, which I hope he will do in the context of talking about his work at the ACLU. By way of background, a little bit more background, he's been at the ACLU for nearly 10 years, and prior to that, he also worked at Human Rights Watch. He leads his team of lawyers conduct human rights research, documentation, public education, as well as engage in litigation and advocacy before international human rights bodies. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jamil.
Thank you, Sheetal, for this really kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for taking the time to spend a few moments here to listen to the work that we do at the ACLU, but how do we challenge really the sad reality where we are right now, which is partly a mess that the United States, I think, takes a major responsibility, particularly with regard to what we're hearing in the news. You're probably hearing the NSA massive surveillance programs, U.S. government spying on other foreign nation leaders, spying on foreign citizens as well as American citizens. You're hearing about drones. You're hearing about massive domestic issues with regard to immigration, detention, the lack of attention to human rights in the criminal justice system, and many, many areas where we're really at the moment where we think that this is time to reverse course. And I'd like to share a few comments and make a few remarks and try to answer some of those tough questions that you posed. And I'd like to start by really saying that, I don't think that there is any argument, at least in the legal circles, that says that international law is not relevant or international law is not even part of our law. In fact, that statement that's been already decided back in 1900 by in a Supreme Court case, the Habana case, that the international law is part of our law. Now the question is certainly comes, and the more skeptical attitudes relates to the enforcement of international law with regard to human rights and individual rights. This is the one where there's more resistance, more, and I would say even an organized movement against recognizing that international human rights plays any role in domestic policy in the United States. And I'd like to address those in a way through some of the examples, some of the work that we do. and offer some suggestions for the future. Because I do think that it is a historic moment where, despite some of the expectations, especially from the current administration, that they would be leading by example, unfortunately we have seen almost the opposite, that there's a continuation of setting a bad example, a bad and dangerous precedent for the world in the area of human rights, something that we should do everything to expose and to stop. One of the things that really make the United States exceptional is the fact that it was one of the major world powers that created the modern system of human rights. It played a significant role in creating the United Nations in 1945. In fact, the first meeting took place in San Francisco on the West Coast before the headquarters moved to New York. The Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948 was largely led by a robust delegation from the US government, led by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The problem with what happened afterwards is that more often US rhetoric has not been matched by concrete actions domestically. The US, while contributed to the creation of the human rights system, whether it's some of the treaties that were adopted by the international human rights community, by the international community, including some that the United States has ratified, but it has played, I would say, a negative role in setting a bad example, on exempting itself from accepting some of those international norms and standards that evolved after the horrors of the Holocaust in the aftermath of World War II. And I think we're still seeing the impact of that role until to this day. We see this in the way in which people, particularly politicians and policymakers, address the issue of human rights. As Chital said, human rights is a foreign concept, at least in the way that it's being presented as if it's something that happens overseas, and not recognizing that human rights has an important role in the United States at all levels. And when we speak about human rights, we're speaking about the federal, state, and local levels. We're speaking about impacting all people, all communities. And I will say a little bit more about that. So the first thing that happened is that for domestic purposes, the United States has chosen in the early 50s and subsequently to stay outside the enforced human rights system, essentially saying, we like those ideas, these are great inspirational principles and ideas, but we're not very much interested in taking serious concrete actions to bring them back here into our countries, something that is contrary to the idea of international human rights, where these are sets of principles and values that are agreed by all countries or all nations, and they agree to take concrete actions at home, at the domestic level, to make those general principles more concrete, detailed, meaningful, effective when it comes to people's lives. So yes, we have civil rights laws, and we have some historically important civil rights law, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, among many others. However, these laws are part of the human rights norms and laws. There are only one important piece of human rights. They don't provide answers to all the things that are addressed by international human rights. And I give you just a simple example. Under current US law, in order for you to prevail in a discrimination on the basis of race or gender, by and large, you have to prove intent in order to prevail. While human rights law essentially advocates or mandates that in order for you to prevail in discrimination cases or to prove discrimination, you don't only have to prove intentional discrimination, but rather the disparate impact, or there's a disproportionate impact on a particular community that is a protected class, to borrow the legal term here. Whether it's women, minority groups, whether you're talking about people with disabilities, and others. So to the extent that the US has laws, civil rights laws have evolved during the civil rights era to address the challenges of historic racial injustice in this country, as well as other parts of injustice, other struggles, women's rights, prisoners' rights, etc. It has not been a complete, the civil rights revolution has not been really completed, because it has not been comprehensive in the way it has not embraced the holistic approach that the human rights movement offers, where no one is really is left behind. When you talk about human rights, one of the really significant things about it is that you are not, rights are not given to you because of citizenship. They're not given to you because of geographic location or site. They're not giving you because who you belong to as a race or religion or a national origin or any kind of background, but it's giving to you as a human being. And it is this value of respecting humanity that the modern system of human rights has been built on. Unfortunately, in the past decade or more, we've seen that not only did the United States exempted itself from taking affirmative obligations and make serious effort to implement the treaties that we at least ratified. The US has ratified only 3 key human rights conventions. In 1992, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in 1994, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. But you will be surprised to know that except for a minor incident or couple of exceptions perhaps, the US has not taken any action to legislate laws, to enact policies that will bring the United States in conformity with these obligations. In fact, only in 2009, the US Senate has held first ever hearing on human rights treaty implementation. And so we not only have the situation where we are exempting ourselves from the protections that we expect other governments to respect, there has been also regression in the way that we have treated basic fundamental human rights, bedrock principles of international human rights. Essentially, areas that were unimaginable to be violated by the United States government. If only 20 years ago, for example, the use of torture in a systemic way, the use of secret detention, holding individuals outside the protection of the law. And we're still seeing the implications of these policies on the people who are held in Guantanamo, where we're still holding people without charge or trial, some perhaps indefinitely, but more so, going beyond the prohibition against torture, which is it's an absolute prohibition that has been agreed upon by all nations, and the United States has championed it to the extent that if you look back at the times in the 80s when the treaty was signed by the United States, in fact, it was signed by the Reagan administration. It was clear that there was no question. So moving beyond the prohibition against torture, the respect to integrity of physical integrity of the person, and so on. Now we're seeing even in areas that are being considered more protective under US law, constitutional law in particular, the right to privacy, the right to due process, are also being violated in a way, in a massive way, I would say, that we have not seen in the past. The recent revelation, thanks to Edward Snowden, we know that the United States government has engaged in a massive surveillance of communications that has not only collected data on Americans in a dragnet programs that are unlawful, and we think that we continue to think that they are unconstitutional, but they also violated the rights of foreigners and non-Americans. And that's why I think at this moment we have the same kind of moment that I think people had after 9/11, where there was an opportunity to look at the place of the United States in the world, and to what extent the U.S. is taking seriously and it's practicing what it's preaching when it comes to human rights. And is there an opportunity to advance human rights, whereas the United States is not only looking for its own narrow interest, something that governments do all the time, but it is really truly going to respect those rights because they are fundamental values of this country, because they are the values of what people believe in when they come to this country and so forth. And I think the divide, the gap that has been created in the terms of U.S. constitutional protections apply to U.S. citizens on U.S. soil and the rest of the world is a fair game for engaging in this massive surveillance. It's just another example of where we have to ask the right questions, and we have to take action. And so it is not only in these areas where, unfortunately, the U.S. is out of step with the rest of the world and is not offering a good example. If you're looking at the criminal justice system, we are incarcerating more people than any nation in the world per capita. In fact, the United States has is 5% of the world's population, but incarcerates 25% of the world's prison population. You have people who are sentenced to life without parole for non-violent crimes, for crimes as simple, as minor as shoplifting and 3 strikes and out laws and so forth. You'd have practices such as solitary confinement that has become a massive violation of human rights across the United States and not examined in the right lens. And when you look at it from a human rights lens, in addition to the civil rights lens, you see that is a serious violation of human rights. It's a serious violation of the right to be free from cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, and even sometimes torture if it's practiced with the intention to cause severe pain and suffering. We're seeing solitary confinement practice on a daily basis. About 80,000 people in this country are subject to solitary confinement any given day, including juveniles, including LGBT, members of LGBT community, including even asylum seekers in immigration detention facilities. If you move to the immigration system, we have developed a system that feeds rights violation. It's a punitive system of immigration detention that shouldn't be that. Many people have not committed any crime. They are being criminalized simply because they had crossed the borders to try to seek opportunity in this country. There are many, many other examples where we are at the point where we're seeing that existing domestic laws and policies are not offering solutions. Now, no one is saying abandoning the U.S. Constitutional Bill of Rights. I don't think anyone is offering that. What we're saying is that the U.S. should also look at its own international human rights commitments, take them seriously. When there are good examples and best practices developed by other nations, just as very often the United States does in the business context when there's good trade practices. No one, hesitates to say, well, that's a good thing. We can do better in terms of. We can do the same in the area of human rights, and I think it takes a lot of effort, but it has to start with people understanding the importance of having the U.S. role, playing this role, playing the good example, playing a positive example in the world, rather than having to be the one that is increasingly becoming an outlier in the area of human rights protections. I think the moment where we are right now, where we're seeing that from different areas we're seeing people who have been advocating for privacy protections, joining forces with human rights advocates. Two communities have not always talked or worked together, coming together. People who are working on issues of migration and development and immigrants' rights and civil rights and human rights coming together. NAACP historically went to the United Nations to raise concerns about injustices in this country, and then spent a lot of its own resources and time and investment in upholding civil rights. NAACP is realizing that civil rights has to be also consistent with human rights. And they are joining forces with the ACLU, with other groups, to hold the US government accountable for the fact that voting rights are being, the most fundamental right in any democracy is being attacked. Voter suppression laws across the country are being seen as a legitimate tool with no regard to what it means to a country where you are also disenfranchising people just because they have spent time in jail. There are over 5 million people in this country that are disenfranchised. They cannot vote, and it varies from state to state simply because they had committed, they are former felons. You have, if you go from every area of law or every area of policy, you have, we have a lot that we can do to make things better. And that's I think, what we need to do is to reverse course by prioritizing human rights. Earlier this week, we were down in Washington, D.C. before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights because we asked the Commission to hold a hearing on NSA surveillance because we thought this is one of the things that the U.S. promotes in the OAS region, in the Western Hemisphere, the promotion and protection of human rights and the role of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to promote those rights. We said, well, let's see how the U.S. government will react to our request and petition with some information about what's happening with the NSA surveillance programs. And we show up on Monday morning and the U.S. government representative says, due to the government shutdown, we were not able to prepare for this hearing, and we're unfortunately be able to adequately engage in this process. That's not a country that prioritizes human rights behaves. That's not how a wealthy country, one of the, if not the wealthiest on earth, behaves. The intersection, looking at human rights with a broad view of not only addressing civil and political rights, and that's the closing remark, but looking at human rights, including social economic rights, economic injustice in this country, something that Dr. King has championed the very early days of his struggle and other leaders in the civil rights movement. This has to resonate. This has to be part of and a priority of people's agenda, of people using the democratic system, calling for accountability and transparency for human rights. We're the only nation, one of the only democratic nations that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, the US and Somalia are the only countries in the world that have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most comprehensive human rights treaty that relates to children's rights. Why is that? Why is that the children in the United States have less rights than, at least by international commitments made by the United States government, than any other country in the world? That is unacceptable. And therefore, there's a way to move forward by incorporating human rights and prioritizing human rights, not only just as paying lip service to human rights, not only in a foreign policy. In fact, the main problem that the United States has is that it's prioritized human rights in the foreign policy, but has neglected it in domestic level. If you go and read many of the statements that the US government is delivering at the international stage, there are very few of them that really promote good practices, because we are not doing so well in many areas of human rights protection on domestic level. I mean, the exception would be LGBT rights, which is obviously something that this administration, and there's been a movement across the nation to support LGBT rights, and that has been something that the US government, State Department has championed abroad as well. But that should not be the case. I think people in the country and studies and polls have clearly showed that the United States, people in the United States, first, they don't have negative attitude of the UN. Majority of Americans think that the UN plays a positive role. UN is not a perfect institution. And when we talk about the human rights mechanism within the United Nations, is only a small piece of the United Nations. But yet, when we come to the United States participation in human rights reviews, it's conceived as a very minimal reporting procedure without having direct impact on the domestic level. Recently, we have seen an active role by the Civil Rights Division and the Justice Department in taking more seriously international human rights, particularly in the area of equality. They established an equality working group, a collaboration between the Justice Department and the State Department in order to look at the implementation of international human rights commitments. This is the first step forward, but it's just a very small step. There are other things that we need to do to engage state and local governments. Most human rights violations happen in the state and local government, not by the federal government. The federal government does have an obligation, does have a lot of resources and role to play in promoting human rights, but it is the state and local governments that should take their responsibility more seriously through different programs and policies that are designed to implement our human rights obligations. And finally, just on this question of treaty ratification, US government not only decided to ratified only 3 treaties so far, the ICCPR, CERD, and the CAT, with 2 optional protocols to the CRC. The current efforts to even ratify the most comprehensive treaty on disability rights, the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, have been voted down last year by notions of sovereignty, by misleading statements made to the Senate, and was short of the 2/3 of the Senate to get it ratified. Despite the fact that the US government, the federal government, has come to the Senate and said, the Disability Rights Convention doesn't change anything. It's not going to change any laws, any policies. In fact, it's not going to cost you a penny. And notwithstanding this, I think remarkable statement, the Senate failed to pass a treaty that has been endorsed by, I think, now over 115 nations, and the number keeps growing almost every month. And despite the fact that the treaty really mirrors a lot of the principles and the values and the practices that are being developed under US law, particularly the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. So if we can do this, if we can ratify the CRPD, what message it sends to the world, what message it sends to the people with disabilities in the United States at the first place? I think any conversation about treaty ratification has to include the potential impact of these treaties and obligations on domestic law and policy. We cannot repeat the same mistakes. Obviously, the political climate is not the right one to do so. But therefore, the need for public education, continuing to do advocacy, engagement with people, and raising awareness. People they don't know enough about the value of human rights, why human rights mean something to communities. And without doing those things, we will not be able to come forward with good faith before the international community to say we are truly a global leader on human rights. Thank you.
We wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, so please go ahead and ask.
Mary Meg.
Hi, Mary Meg McCarthy from the National Immigrant Justice Center. You mentioned the LGBT rights movement as being an example where we've seen human rights propel our country to move forward in a positive way. What lessons have we learned from that movement that we can apply in these other areas that you discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of what we're seeing is that what happened really in the early 50s, 60s, and 70s, I would say, in many areas where the United States has done a good job at promoting rights, free speech, freedom of assembly, the due process, fair trial, the rights of people in the criminal justice system more broadly. The fact that the U.S. was developing domestic laws and policies, and the Supreme Court cases decisions would be cited by other courts around the world, had made that impact. Similarly now, what we're seeing is that in the area of LGBT rights, because of the significant or positive development that's happening, both in terms of law and policy, particularly the recent Supreme Court decisions, as well as the movement toward equality for LGBT communities in this country, have made the U.S. government lead actor in the international arena. I mean, it's that dynamic where when you have a domestic movement that is a strong one, building alliances across communities, connecting the value of equality as a fundamental right with the history of equality and the value of equality in this country, that made the difference, that made the advancement in addressing LGBT rights. There's no wonder that the lead organization on LGBT rights the title of the organization is Human Rights Campaign. I mean, they're not seen as the human rights organization in the sense of promoting international human rights. Obviously, they're committed to international human rights, but they understand the value of human rights in their struggle. And I think that commitment, you hear it across. So I think the human rights movement, even if it was not explicitly raised, was not say, oh, we are going to, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, was not the slogan of this movement, but it was really carrying the fundamental principles of the human rights framework that has transcended, and has been utilized by the LGBT rights community across the nation with the right, I think, political climate that made it, made for these changes. But it's not over. I mean, there's still lack of legislation in many areas. There's still states resisting, some of the, whether it's in areas of equality. We have pending legislation on issues of violence against LGBT youth and protecting of youth from violence. There's a lot of areas that the U.S. is still not, showing the best record. But I think that started a movement. Now, in other movement, the problem with, if you take two examples, immigrants' rights, and particularly migrants, and in the area of national security. In those two areas, you don't have the strongest domestic constituency to rally, to champion their cause. Because migrants, just as in any other country, they don't have a right to vote. They're not part of the electorate. They are in the shadows most of the time. They're not fully participating in the political process. They are being demonized in most of the cases and being abused. And they're not seen as a real constituency, except that when you saw the results of the last election, and no wonder, all of a sudden said there was some political calculation that now went into prioritizing issue of immigration reform because that's also they are seen as a demographic that has potential, his future role in political system. It's positive, but still, we're still not seeing the end result. Immigration reform, in fact, is not going in the right direction if we just look at the bill that was passed by the Senate. The over-militarization of the border raises serious, significant challenges and problems, human rights problems as well, that will continue to be challenged. And Mary Meg's organization is doing a great job in this area. Just to mention the other example, people who are held at Guantanamo, or people who were tortured, people who are being now, let's say, even non-Americans who are being subject to massive surveillance. People don't have the political power in the United States. They don't have their champions in the United States, other than, of course, domestic human rights, civil rights organizations. They don't have the same kinds of ability to influence and mobilize communities and raise awareness in the media and otherwise in order to affect change. So therefore, we have a much more difficult job and we have not been able and successful in, for example, holding any high-level official accountable for the torture and abuse of hundreds, if not thousands, of detainees. Not a single high-level official, not in the military, neither in the civilian leadership. We have not been able to shut down the second-class system of justice at Guantanamo. Military commission system continues to hold hearings at Guantanamo with unimaginable examples of setting dangerous examples to the world. People who were tortured can't speak about their torture in court of law because what happened to them, their experience of being subjected to torture is classified. That's what happened. Last week, the argument before one of the arguments before the military commission was, do those detainees have the right under the Convention Against Torture to put forward request, for example, to cooperate with investigations outside the United States? Poland is now before the European Court of Human Rights for hosting a CIA secret facility on its soils where detainees were waterboarded and tortured. Now, if we had similar kinds of commitment to human rights, we would not have probably the levels of massive violations of human rights that we've seen in the past decade, because at least the checks and balances will be much more robust. I mean, unfortunately, even the constitutional protections were undermined. I mean, we had an administration that said even a U.S. citizen doesn't have access to a lawyer when he was held in military custody on U.S. soil. In the case of Jose Padilla, and we can go on and on. So I think thinking about there's different challenges, the different constituencies. So when we're talking about immigrants' rights and migrants' rights, I think the good organizing and the advocacy of immigrant communities as well as other groups supporting immigrants' rights and fair immigration reform, I think coupled with the fact that politically it was the right moment for bipartisan push, at least got the conversation to be at the top of the national agenda. In some other areas, we will be less lucky. Similarly, death penalty. I mean, we are seeing a movement against the death penalty. Just yesterday, a recent poll showed that in the United States, the lowest majority, it was still a majority of Americans favor the death penalty. But it's the lowest majority since 1970, in 40 years. And that's progress. I mean, it's hard to say that, but it's truly a progress. When you have, just in the past 5 years, you have 5 states that have abolished the death penalty, including in the state of Illinois, which is a great development. Yet, we have still people on death row. We have still people who were sent to death based on wrong convictions. We still have people who are held in solitary confinement when they are on death row. We still have serious problems that are really hard to tackle. But the movement, I think, is expanding. And it's this intersection of groups realizing that if you are violating the rights of one individual or one community, it's a violating of the rights of entire community, the entire population, in fact, citizenry of the United States. I mean, it's just the same notion that we borrow from Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere, injustice everywhere. And so we just have to continue to learn from these historic struggles and build on successes, and there are baby steps, and we'll get there.
Well, thank you for your work.
Yes, please.
As I think you kind of touched on in that question, the Senate, and I think their constituents too, and that's maybe why they are very weary of, I was interviewing in the Senate when the Treaty of Rights of the Child came up, and we were phone calls. We're suspicious of, as a nation, not us in this room, but of foreigners, of the outside world we maybe don't care about. We do have laws that, in theory, should be protecting things. To what extent, both with any kind of import from international human rights, really just have to consist of us passing laws within our own system that mirror them? And to what extent could litigation of the laws that we currently have get there? Or is kind of like the increasing military action and confidential obstructing justice to a point that we can't get any further?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because one thing that we're seeing is that when we win cases before the Supreme Court and make laws on for example, LGBT equality or ending or at least circumventing the implications of these anti-immigrants measures, like the SB 1070 in Arizona. When we get those victories by the Supreme Court decisions, especially when there's an impasse, gridlock in Congress, and there's no movement, these translate to where the U.S. says, "Oh, we are getting closer to comply with international obligations." In fact, if you look at the reports that the United States submits to international human rights treaties, they cite more case law than laws that were enacted by Congress, simply because it is, if there's any positive impact, that is really coming for the most part. And you have a conservative judiciary. I mean, you're not talking about the Warren Court situation where you're getting all these, protections of fundamental rights, individual rights in different aspects. So I think to your question, yes, there is this process where, while we are not going to be able to ratify treaties, but the alternative is not to say, "Oh, these don't matter." I think what matters is to keep using other avenues for change, for advancement of human rights in the United States, through these kinds of advocacy. Although United States, courts would not and still do not hear, international human rights claims because simply they are not recognized as enforceable in U.S. courts. So what we are trying to do is you're using supplementing, and even if not in litigation, you're doing some other work. The human rights documentation work is valuable in this regard in order to affect change. There's organizing, building coalitions towards pushing for policy changes that sometimes may not cite the CRC or the CRPD, but they would embed, they would incorporate the values and the norms of these treaties and human rights values. So there's that process where you can push towards ending rights violations. So for example, if you look at the solitary confinement, there is a movement now to end solitary confinement in the United States. There are some states actually taking good steps in passing laws to curtail the use of solitary confinement in different contexts. That's a complementary. There are a number of things that could happen at the state and local level that could actually project and could reinforce the national support or national laws that would end those violence. So I think that there's for the treaty ratification, I think there's still a notion of the U.S. sovereignty is being attacked, but they are really not based on for example, the Bush administration appeared before the different committees at the UN, just as the Obama administration did. The US government submitted reports to these committees, and no one has said anything while that happened during the Bush administration. All of a sudden, Republican senators saying, we cannot subject ourselves to this body of experts who sit in Geneva. Who are there? And when you try to explain that there's nothing really going to be forced on the United States. As was said, I don't think the Security Council anytime soon is going to pass a resolution to send troops into Louisiana to end death penalty or to end any massive violations, anywhere in the country. It is through really that democratic process is going to happen. But a true democracy is the one that is being held to account. And we're not seeing human rights accountability at a domestic level. And this goes across not only federal level, but state and local level.
I guess this kind of goes off of the last question. What do you think can be done about how partisan the discussions on human rights have become in the United States? I mean, I think by their very definition, human rights are not partisan, but I think especially in the United States, they have become very partisan. So what do you think we can do in the United States to change that?
I think it's the notion that, first of all, that human rights is not a foreign concept. It's something that the United States it takes credit. The United States and both administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, should take credit for their role in creating modern system of human rights and in promoting international human rights. They are not foreign concepts because if you look at the values and the ideals behind the human rights, are they mirror by and large the values, whether it's a Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights, of course with gaps. It's just simply because where you're not having the U.S. Constitution when it was framed, it wasn't something that has been addressed the challenges of 21st century. Now, the question is whether we're going to stick to the past or have a United States that will stay in the 20th century or worse, earlier centuries, or you want to see a United States that has moved forward in the treatment of its own citizens first as fairly, as humane as possible, and then its interaction with the world based on these ideals. And so I don't think that there is a disagreement about that. The disagreement comes when it's really a matter of choices and priorities and where do you input what kinds of interests you are advancing. For example, there are some who see human rights as, shifting power balance. I mean, it's true. When you try to pass a law that is going to protect a particular group of people their rights were violated, that's, of course, they're empowering this group. You're not going to, I think it would be unjust to pass a law that would only make people, more oppressed. So I think on the fairness point, I think it resonates with Americans. Again, polls show that it's not a foreign concept. It's the politicization. It's not only the human rights. It's the politicization of many other things in this country that made it more difficult. But in the area of human rights, because you're talking about individual rights, we're talking about things that has to do with social justice, with perhaps even an advanced conversation, economic justice. Then it comes to what are you talking about here? So I think there are things that have to be those examples, historic examples, but also contemporary examples. Americans are not disconnected from the rest of the world. Even people in Kansas who are not going to leave Kansas their entire life are affected by international system, whether it's in the area of human rights or whether it's in other areas, whether it's trade, commerce, just, whatever they do, even getting postal mail, it has to do with, way we interact with the world. So to interact with the world, there's a new system that the United States built, which we have to respect and interact with it in good faith and with, less hypocrisy, but more showing good example, which will benefit the people of the United States. So there's a benefit by showing those kinds of good practices at the end of the day. At some point, if a country continues to show bad example and they become really an outlier, a lot of countries, when their interest not with supporting this kind of practice, they will say, we have a problem with that. And we're seeing the beginning of that, although there's a lot of hypocrisy by some foreign intelligence services that are now, directing the blame to the NSA. Well, the NSA is to blame for the main responsible, but foreign intelligence services do, spy on other countries and do the same kinds of, not at the massive scale of the NSA. So, but we have to look at the basic level of individual rights, or the privacy of individuals. What is that going to make our life look like down the road? How is it going to affect people's engagement with the world, and particularly the United States' status in the world? And I think to that, including those who are really oppose human rights now, will see the value as we continue the conversation. But the problem is, most of the time, people were shying away from the conversation. They don't want to have the honest and frank conversation about what's the value added, what are the benefits of having a human rights system that the U.S. abiding by its human rights commitments and promoting them in a good faith and in a way that will really bring a good not only for the United States but the rest of the world. That conversation, we have to have this conversation. And I think that's why I think it's a historic opportunity now where people are saying, you can't divide people by Americans and non-Americans. I mean, when it comes to communication services now, you're traveling. There are millions of Americans travel. One of the things that was advanced by people who listen to the CRPD, the Disability Rights Convention, the main argument was a lot of Americans with disabilities travel around the world, and if it would be a good idea to have more accessible, more accommodated facilities for them to be able to participate fully in life in the United States and outside the United States.
So we don't have any more time for questions. I really just wanted to thank Jamil. He'll be here a couple minutes if you have questions afterward. Thank you.